Well, 3:31, late. Welcome everyone to the Small Grains for Brewing and Distilling Happy Hour once again. This week we're going to be focusing on alternative uses for barley other than malting for brewing and distilling. So it's one of the biggest asks that we have in our value chain in our barley industry in Michigan is, what are we going to do with this barley if it doesn't make malting grade, or even if it is malting grade, if we don't have a buyer that's able to take it? Some growers have sold to maltsters out of state, but transportation's a big factor in that, and costly. Storage is costly, so having another value stream for barley that's not going into a malt house or directly into a distillery is super important for building a healthy, sustainable industry. And our first speaker today will be Dr. J.K. Kim, and he has some really, really cool information about malted barley and its effect on ruminants. And I will not, spoil that anymore for him. So, J.K., if you want to take over, he's got some slides to show us, and yeah, I'm excited.
Okay. Yes. Choose this. Okay. Can you see this, right?
Yep. That's
okay. Good. Let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jong-gyu Kim. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science and Food Science and Human Nutrition. So my appointment is joint appointment between animal science and food science, but the most part is animal science. So my role in the department is mostly research, and mostly research and some of teaching. So my research focus on the muscle biology and meat science and those kind of things in beef cattle. So I already shared about my barley, the malting barley idea, like several months ago, and I just put some new things in this slide, and most of them will be really kind of new things. So what I'm going to talk about today is the fatty acid, an alternative growth promoter in beef cattle. So also going to talk how we can utilize barley and broad spent grain as a sustainable fatty acid sources. So my presentation have two parts. The first part is about the fatty acid, and then second part is going to be the malting barley. So part one is the fatty acid, which is the one of the most abundant phenolic compounds in the hull of barley, which can potentially potential growth promoting agent. So before we get started, I just want to talk a little bit about background of growth promoting techniques. So the world population is steeply increased. So the meat production is expected to be double by 2020 since 1950s. The problem is we do not have enough natural resources, just like water and land, feed stuff, and so on and so on. So that's why we need to use any kind of science to fulfill the meat demand. This is actually the good example over here. So the 1970s, we just harvest 45 million head to fulfill the demand. And in 2017, we harvest like 30 million. So the 15 million less in 2017. This is because the size of the animal is dramatically increased. So as you can see, it was 579 pounds. In 1970s, it went up to the 800 pounds. So there's some couple of reasons. The first reason is that we select the really good animals, the big animals, and the second reason is that we use very nice like growth promoting techniques such as straight hormone implant and beta-adrenergic agonist. This is actually a really good example. This is the picture from the livestock show in San Antonio in Texas. As you can see, the cattle size are like tiny. So I feel like it's like around like 500 pounds or something like that. And then in that 2019, the cattle, the size is the weight about like 1,300 pound and 1,400 pound at the finishing stage. So there you can actually visually see how their sizes are changing in the last few decades.
And
These are
JK has the efficiency, the growth efficiency improved. I mean, you can grow a bigger cow, but if it takes more, just as much or more, you haven't really gained anything.
yeah. Oh, sorry. Can you say it again?
So has the efficiency of the food, of their use of their conversion to meat improved, because even though it's a bigger cow, if it's the same efficient use of the food, then you haven't gained anything.
So I mean, we can use the less amount of natural resources, and we can expect the more meat. That's what I'm talking about. So just like so efficient way. I mean, I don't know. So what you're asking me about.
I think you might have answered it.
Yeah.
It takes less resources to produce that bigger cow.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Yeah, less resources and then produce large amount of meat. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Yeah. So there are like several different types of growth promotants used in the U.S. beef cattle industry. Starting from the DES, we have so many different types of steroid hormone implant. I'll just point out just a couple of those. Estradiol, benzoate, and trembolone acetate. Those are one of the most widely used steroid hormone implant in the beef cattle industry these days. The steroid hormone implants are like little pellet, and they go into the backside of the cattle's ears, and affect for like several days to several months. And other types of growth promoting technique is the beta-adrenergic agonist. So the red colors, the rectopamine hydrochloride and the gilpetrol hydrochloride, these are basically the top dressing. So just give those kind of the beta-adrenergic agonist to finishing cattle for up to 30 days. So by using these beta-adrenergic agonists, we can expect to increase final live weight, and it can also increase the hard carcass weight, and also dressing percentage, and also increase the ribeye area. So, just to calculate the profit based on the hot carcass weight, we can expect like $30 to $40 per head by using that beta-adrenergic agonist. But the problem is the consumers doesn't like those kind of chemicals. So it's just like in 2013, the gilpetrol hydrochloride, which is the product name is Gilmex, produced by Merck, was banned from the major meat packers, especially the Tyson, because of they really worried about some animal welfare issue. Some of cattle lost their hooves and during the hot climate. But there is actually no like scientific evidence that Gilmex actually directly impact on animal welfare. But anyway, the people don't like it. People don't like using chemicals on your everyday beef. So the scientists trying to find an alternative method to alternative growth promoting techniques. If we don't use those kind of growth techniques, we may need to have extra resources. It's like we need more cattle, like 3.5 million cattle. We may need more water, 195 billion gallon. We need more land. It's like 14,000 square miles is equivalent to the size of Maryland. So that is kind of wasting our resources. So So we need to find any kind of alternative growth promoting techniques. There are so many different types of candidates, just like the minerals and amino acid, the fatty acid, so on and so on. But there's many people are looking at the phytochemicals, are also looking at the phytochemicals, and they're very suitable candidate of the alternative growth promotants. Among them, I'm looking at the fatty acid, which was one of the most abundant the phenolic compounds in the grain. The beta-adrenergic agonists, as I mentioned, like the glypetrol hydrochloride and ractopamine hydrochloride, they are regulating the cell signaling pathways in the target tissues like skeletal muscle and adipose tissue by binding the specific beta-adrenergic receptor. So the previous research said the fatty acid actually bind to same receptor, beta-adrenergic agonist receptor, and they have similar effect of the beta-adrenergic agonist. It means that we can increase the skeletal muscle and decrease a little bit about the fat accumulation in the body. The good thing about fatty acid is they're everywhere in the grain. So it's just like barley in the brand, we can find like 2,000 milligram per 100 gram, and the broad pant grain is about full of fatty acid is about like 2,000 milligram per 100 gram. So the previous research conducted in Mexico, they found that the 4,000 milligram of fatty acid per head actually increased the size of the steak. So if you feed like, I don't know, it's like 200 gram or 300 gram, we can easily fulfill that amount of fatty acid. And also the interesting thing about the broad spent grain is they contains large amount of fatty acid esterase. So fatty acid esterase FAE is very important since the fatty acid is close linked to the polysaccharides by the ester bond, just like as you can see over here. They're bond there, and they're very strong structure. So if the animal intake that kind of form of fatty acid, they are not able to absorb the fatty acid at all. So the fatty acid needs to be deesterified from the dietary fiber to be absorbed. So the FAE, the fatty acid esterase, which is rich in BSG or barley as well, they just break down all the cross link and ester bond, and they release the free fatty acid. It's like that. So what I'm thinking is, if we can mix the barley grain and a broad spent grain, and we can just maximize the amount of free fatty acid which can absorb in the animal body and used for muscle growth, and then decrease some sort of the fat accumulation in animal body. Okay, so second part of my research idea is about the malting. So we already talked about this in several months ago. So there's 3 steps. Larry told me about how this malting process is working. So I learned so many things about that. And there are 3 steps: steeping and germination and kilning. So what we are looking at is the germination. So during the germination period, enzyme called alpha amylase spikes up, and then this starch, the starch breaks down into the small sugars like maltose and glucose. And these small sugars can be used as an energy source in animal body. So you can actually improve the starch utilization. This is kind of possible scenario. So I don't know how it possibly work actually happen in animal body. It possibly not happen, but this is kind of scenario. So the carbohydrate is main energy source in finishing cattle. So the finishing cattle, the cattle in the finishing stage intake large amount of corn. So in human or other types of animal like monogastric animals like pig have alpha amylase in their saliva, so they start to break down the starch from the mouth. But the interesting thing is cattle does not have alpha amylase in their saliva. So if you give exogenous alpha amylase into the cattle, the starch digestion starts from the mouth in cattle as well. It leads to increased propionate, which is one of volatile fatty acid. This propionate is kind of important since the propionate convert into glucose in the liver through the process called gluconeogenesis. And this glucose can be used for energy and also used as substrate for the intramuscular adipose tissue. So intramuscular adipose tissue is marbling. So if you can increase the glucose uptake, you can expect more marbling in the steak. So another interesting thing about the malting grain is they can be a greenhouse gas reducer. So the ruminants are blamed for the global warming. As you can see the graph over here, the cattle produce large amount of the gases, including the methane, the nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. Um, uh, the the in vitro study using the artificial rumen, what we found was that the malted barley, 30% malted barley, decreased the production of gas compared to the corn-based diet. So this is going to be our objective of the study, what we're going to do in the near future. So first thing is determine the regulatory effect of fatty acid on the skeletal muscle fiber hypertrophy and adipose cell accumulation through the beta-adrenergic receptor signaling pathway. So basically, we're going to do the primary cell culture study to see how this fatty acid actually affect on the cell growth. And the second thing is animal feeding study. So what we're going to do is to feed the free fatty acid and the fatty acid rich grain like barley and BSG. And we want to see the influence on the performance, the carcass characteristics, and the serum metabolite responses, and the gene expressions, protein levels in the longis muscle side using the muscle biopsy technique. This is kind of schematic pictures how we're going to do the bovine satellite cell culture. So we're going to isolate the semi-membranous's and then grind them, use pronase and isolate the satellite cell, which is like muscle stem cells. You can actually see the cells over here. At this point, we put different doses of fatty acid and then incubate for like 96 hours to 120 hours and harvest them and use for the RNA and protein analysis. The second experiment what we're going to do is animal feeding study. So I think it's going to happen next fall or something like that. And you're going to need 36 Angus cemental steers. The body weight is going to be the 950 to 1,000 pounder. Those are the finishing stage. So we're going to use 4 treatments. So the first treatment is corn-based diet with distilled grain. That's going to be the control. And this another treatment is corn diet with the control diet with the 2,000 milligram of fatty acid and also 4,000 milligram of fatty acid. The last one is the barley-based diet with broad spent grain, and I think this diet contain over 6,000 milligram of fatty acid per head. This is the process of longitudinal muscle biopsy. So just make the little incision on the back of cattle and then use specialized the muscle biopsy needle and can get some 0.5 grams of the muscle chunk and use for the other analysis. As a summary, I just want to talk a little bit about the novelty of our study and how we can value for Michigan barley growers. So I think our feeding program can be sustainable since the barley price is kind of stable compared to corn, and it is also available throughout the year. As we mentioned before, using the malt barley, we can improve feed efficiency. We can use the less feed. We can uh, expect more growth. So it lead to reduced cost of production. And also we can reduce greenhouse gas, which is good for our motherland, and also reduce energy loss from gas, which means that we can also uh, improve the feed efficiency. And we can utilize no-meal quality barley sources, like you can use the vomitoxin infected grains up to 10 ppm. So this can be extra money for the grain producers. And this feeding program also can be a value-added program since we use fatty acid, which is phytochemical, and malting and sprouting. All sounds very, very healthy. So I think this could be a unique selling point of beef products. It's like the healthier barley sprout fed beef or something like that. Okay, that is it. If you have any questions, I'll happy to take from now.
I got a little bit confused about the biopsy and exactly what you were looking for in the biopsy.
So biopsy. So once the cattle intake fatty acid, they go into the GI tract and is absorbed in the GI tract. They go into the bloodstream and finally go into the target cells like tissues like muscle and adipose cells. And these fatty acid reach the target tissues and change something inside of the cells. And we have to see the muscle level, how they change it. So if we get the muscle biopsy, we actually see the gene expressions and protein levels, how they are different, how they are changed by the fatty acid for long time. You know, we can sample like several times in the same spot, right? So we can actually see the changes using the muscle biopsy.
Okay, that makes sense.
Could you go back to the figure? There's two figures where it showed greenhouse gas production.
Greenhouse gas.
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah.
So in the figure, there we go. In the figure on the left, is that bottom light blue curve, is that pasture grass-fed beef?
This one?
Yeah.
This one is just amylase. We just put the amylase as a chemical.
Oh, okay.
So you can just compare the malted barley versus just straight amylase. So it's like the malting barley is strong as much as the amylase itself. It's like,
Gotcha.
yeah, these are like different barley. So this one is the malted barley from Korea. This is malted barley from US. Yeah, there's Canadian one. So yeah, I don't know what breed are they, but yeah, we just purchased from the market and I used them for treatment.
So Ryan, work we've done at KBS basically shows that pasture-based animals will produce more methane compared to grain-based. And JK, tell me if you have like similar data, but grass has more fiber, takes more effort to digest to get more gas production compared to simple grains that are easy to digest.
That's true. Yeah.
Gotcha. Greater metabolic activity to digest the grass.
Right. On the flip side, the argument that pasture-based producers use is that the farming methods result in storage of carbon in the soil, Whereas in a cornfield, it's more difficult to store carbon in the soil than in a perennial pasture that's managed well. So you can offset some of that extra greenhouse gas emission from the cow itself by storing carbon in the soil.
Yeah, that's a valid justification. Corn production produces a lot of CO2 as well.
Right.
Yeah.
That's interesting though. I'm assuming the Korean barley was lower in alpha amylase overall. I would guess that a lot of Korean barley is being grown for food purposes.
Yeah, right. And they're stored in the shelf for a while. So we just go to the market and buy it from the Korean market. So
Oh,
yeah. Yeah, it's not a good quality of barley, the market barley.
So some of our two-row barleys that are bred for all malt production may have reduced effect in this purpose compared to the 6-row adjunct style grains because of really high alpha amylase in those grains,
Yeah.
right?
yeah.
So okay, go ahead, right.
Oh yeah, I would guess that to be true, Brooke. But I could see it being a good risk reward proposition for growing something like Synergy, which is extremely high in alpha amylase, but it has sprout risk. So if you pulled it off really well, like Gary West has, and ended up with great Western style, like really enzymatically hot barley that shouldn't really grow well here, great, it gets into a malt house. But if there's flaws and it doesn't get accepted, then it could be like sort of a supercharged barley for this purpose as well. That's pretty neat.
So on those tissue studies, if I saw the treatments right, you're basically doing spent grains for both. You're not doing just straight malted barley.
Yeah, this is kind of different study. So it's like the malting study I was planning to do with USDA and IRS, and they're gonna fund this project. But all the COVID deal, and they not to fund this project for this fiscal year, so we just postponed all the malting project. And I'll also skeptical for these maltings is the alpha amylase reduce methane production, but at the same time, alpha amylase decrease rumen pH a lot. So the alpha amylase break down starch too much in the rumen, and then the lactate spikes up. So that is very bad thing about very bad thing in the rumen. We already know about that. And so I just postponed all the malting stuff. All the malting stuff. So now I'm focusing on the fatty acid at this moment. Yeah, that's why I don't have any malting group over here.
But just the straight malted also was higher in ferulic acid, right, or not? Did I get that wrong? It did have to go through the brewing or distilling process to get the bump.
The grain itself has large amount of fatty acid. If you do the malting, yeah.
Does malting also increase it?
Yeah, because the ferulic acid stay at the heart. So if you have sprout, I think they increase ferulic acid amount as well. If you know anything about that, correct me. That's what I'm guessing.
I was muted. Sorry, the cell wall modification and breakdown that takes place for malting barley releases a lot of that ferulic acid. Same thing in rye and wheat as well, if they're malted. There's also in brewing, if you mash in at a really low temperature, like 45 degrees C, I think Aaron McLeod was talking about that too. It's a little bit lower than a protein rest, so it's a ferulic acid rest. and you can really drive release of that ferulic acid really well. So yeah, it's naturally occurring in malting, but you can do some things to actually accentuate that release of ferulic acid from arabinoxylan or beta glucan, whichever the particular hemicellulose is. So pretty cool.
What happens with pre-harvest sprout? Does that increase it? So can you just let it sprout in the field and?
In theory.
I don't know.
I wouldn't advise that, but I mean, it should work.
Yeah, so
it might not be very controllable is what you're basically saying.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, we were having a hard time adjusting the price of malting grains. So it's too expensive to use for feed purpose. So yeah, we calculated like several times using different scenario where it's way too expensive. So yeah, I'm kind of negative right now using malted grain as the beef cattle feed.
Yeah, I mean, if you're able to accept barley that's got DON or deoxynivalenol in a full order of magnitude higher concentration than is acceptable for malting, then it becomes more tenable then.
Yeah.
Do we know if, okay, so if you do the standard malting process, and then we're also looking at, let's say you have malted barley that you can't get rid of, but could you actually create a malting process that would give you even more ferulic acid than what you get out of the standard malting process?
Yeah, but it would be resource intensive. It would be at least as resource intensive as malting just the normal way.
Okay, so it wouldn't be like a shorter process or a cooler process or something that could get in the economic feasibility range.
No, I don't think so. Unless you treated it completely differently. So if you were just sprouting in a big, like something that looked like a rotating corn dryer or something like that, you just had basically a giant sprout jar turning. But drying it down is costly. Keeping things cool in the summer is costly.
Yeah.
And then alpha amylase is positively correlated to time during germination. So the more time you commit to it, the higher alpha amylase levels you get. But that's
okay.
Yeah. But in the scenario where you can't do anything at all with your barley that's in the bin, then alternative strategies are worth pursuing. So I'm going to switch over to Larry. Dr. Larry Judge is uniquely positioned to talk about the subject because he's a maltster, founder of Mitten State Malt, and he's also a doctor of veterinary medicine, specializing in cows and steers.
I work mostly with dairy, but I do a lot of beef too. I'm actually doing a presentation for the company that I work part-time for, which is a distributor based in Wisconsin. Doing a presentation for them next week on growth implants. So, but just a few comments. JK is right. Consumers really don't like to hear the word hormone. There's two words that strike terror into the hearts of every consumer of animal products, and that's antibiotics and hormones. And hormones may be the bigger one. A lot of our beef that we do eat is implanted. The big feed plots, use those growth implants that JK talked about. Because they return a dollar investment of $5 to $10 to one, for every dollar invested. So they definitely help feed conversion, help the animal convert grain into muscle mass. But at the same time, a lot of producers don't like it. A lot of my small feedlots I work with actually will either not implant or keep some cattle not implanted if they do, just for private customers that are looking for, non-implanted beef, and they're willing to pay a premium for that. But yeah, if we had a more natural way of enhancing growth and meat quality that was through feed, that would be much more accepted by customers for sure, since it wouldn't involve, exogenous hormones or things that consumers would deem unnatural. They would see that as a more natural process. So, and we definitely need an alternative market here for our non-multiple barley, especially high don barley or pre-sprouted barley. In Canada, that's what they do. They can't grow corn as well as we do because of their climate's too cold. So primarily Canadian feedlots feed barley to their cattle. Here we've got, corn coming out our ears, literally. So, I've tried to sell some of my non-malted or my barley that was slightly high vomitoxin to some of the small feedlots I work with. And, even though I offered them at like corn price, like, $3 a bushel, they still say, well, is it better than corn? I'm like, well, it's similar, this is before I knew, the barley could make the meat quality better. And I'd say it's similar. And they'd say, well, if it's similar to corn, why don't I just buy corn for the same price? And so they just have never fed barley. Now, when I was young on our dairy farm, we fed barley to our milking cows every summer. We grow spring barley, harvested as high moisture, about 30% moisture, put it in one of those blue, what are called harvesters, those blue oxygen limiting silos. Then it would ferment slightly, run CO2 in there to keep that wet barley from molding. And we fed that all summer to our cows. But I say we don't do that anymore. We quit because, we figured out how to grow corn better. That was back when I always say we didn't know how to grow corn. 100 bushel to acre corn at that time was considered phenomenal corn. Now 100 bushel to acre corn is a major crop failure. We're looking for 200 plus bushels now. The US average is like 160 or 50 to 170 across the US. So, back then, we struggled to get 100. So, and that's due to plant breeding, better varieties, and better disease control. So, but yeah, with corn being so cheap and plentiful here, that makes it a little hard on the barley side. But if we could tell them there's advantages to feeding the barley in terms of better meat quality and growth efficiency, if we knew that scientifically from work like JK is doing, then that would be a selling point for us to sell that barley to these feedlots.
So is it more use efficiency or is it more feed quality? I hear small ruminant guys and some beef folks say they really like to finish on barley when they say that, and I guess I've never pushed them on what they mean by that. What are they talking about? More quality, or are they talking more efficiency, or is it the combination?
Probably the combination, I would guess. Yeah. But they probably have seen some advantage to meat quality with the barley and better marbling on those small ruminants. So that's probably a factor. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, the feeding the barley make the fat white. So it's like the corn contains a large amount of keratin, so it may the fat yellow. But if you feed barley at the finishing stage of cattle or small ruminant, you can actually see the whiter fat.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Consumers really don't like to see yellow fat in their meat. They kind of assume that even if that's natural, they kind of assume that that's kind of like rancid fat if that's yellow. They like to see a bright white meat. That's why these Mangalitsa pigs that have kind of gotten popular. And I actually sell some of my barley right now, or not raw so much, but the malted barley that didn't come out so well, a batch that just, alpha amylase was low or beta glucan's high. I sell that at a kind of a discounted price, like $5 a 50-pound bag, just to cover my barley cost. to a producer of these Mangalitsa pigs right now, because they really want that white fat in these pigs. That's a selling point. But even in beef, any beef, it's the reason why the Jersey breed of cattle, dairy cattle, people don't want to ever raise Jersey steers for meat, even though their meat quality is very good, but oftentimes their fat will be a little yellow. Their fat really tends to yellow up more than other breeds do if they get much beta carotene in their diet, much corn, and consumers don't like that yellow fat. They just think that looks terrible. Even if the meat tastes fine, it's fine. They just don't like to see that yellow fat. The other selling point for barley to feed to meat producing animals is the GMO issue, because virtually all corn now is GMO. And a lot of consumers don't like the thoughts of GMOs at all in their food, even if they don't even really understand what they are. A lot of times they don't even know what GMO means. They just heard it's bad, so they don't want it. But all of our barley, as we know, is GMO because we've not chosen to go down that path. So if you finish cattle on barley, whether it's malted or not, you could market it as non-GMO beef as well. And there's a lot of consumers would pay a premium for that.
Do inspectors rate the meat better with, I'm sure, probably with more marbling, right?
Sure, yeah. The higher the marbling, the higher the grade.
Great, yeah.
There's all these grades of beef, but the higher the grade, the more it's worth. So, yeah.
What about do they rate the white
Yeah, they
versus
do.
the yellow higher?
Yeah, they do.
Sure.
There's a
Yep. Okay.
What about in when you ensile high moisture barley grain? Is there any alpha amylase produced during that ensiling process? Do you know?
Well, we don't usually ensile it. If the grain, we just store it like on our family farm, we stored it at high moisture. So it would ferment a little until the oxygen we used up, but then we would always, since there wasn't much in the silo, we would pump CO2 in there to kind of stop the aerobic process too and keep it. So it probably produced a little bit of acid, but not like forage silage would, which produces a lot of acid, as you know.
Yeah, I just didn't know if that storage at higher moistures, obviously it's producing some acid and the pH is dropping.
Yeah.
A little bit, right?
Yep.
And you're storing it that way, but does that process also stimulate some activation of enzymes like alpha amylase? And could we accomplish, a really cheap way to get that get some through that process?
Yeah.
Malting.
I would assume it would a bit. It would grow a little bit if it had some oxygen. Yeah, it would a bit. But when JK toured my facility, we talked about, and he said this is kind of an unknown at this point, is that at what point in the process of that seed growing and developing, do we get to a significant amount of the ferulic acid that would make a difference? Because one of the more expensive parts of malting is the drying, the kilning. And he said, well, we probably wouldn't even need to do that, but once that product's wet, it has very limited short life too until we dry it. So you'd almost have to have that steeping germination capacity on farm, feed it right away, because that germinated but yet unkilned product has got a very short shelf life, as I'm sure you all know.
Yeah, we actually don't like to feed wet feed since it decreases like dry matter intake. So it's not a good thing. So we can remove kilning process, and but still we have too much water in the feed.
Yeah, at that point, our malting barley probably going in the kiln is what, Ryan? Probably upper 30s to 40% moisture.
Yeah. Somewhere around 45. That's like the magic number, right? For water transport and enzymatic transport in the kernel. Like that's what we're trying to target. So
Yeah, I usually try to steep to 46 to 48 and then lose about 1% a day through germination. So yeah, it's got to be at least into the 40s, which is, we can feed diets like that. Our diets we feed dairy cattle are what are called total mixed rations, are usually 50% moisture. But those rations have to be mixed. They're ensiled feeds and grains, proteins, vitamin, mineral, all mixed together. But we have to, we can't, once that product is out of the mixed up and fed, or I mean, mixed up, we have to feed it right away. It doesn't have any kind of shelf life to it at that point.
Yeah, germination can really run away from you, and it really acidifies too, and creates this like really terrible positive feedback loop. So yeah, you get that like lactic acid bacteria going on. They heat up the grain bed, produce CO2, acidify it even more, and then they're creating their own perfect environment, which is great for them, but not for us.
Yeah, seeing cattle love acid. I mean, our ensiled feeds that we feed have just a ton of lactic acid in it, and cattle love that acid taste, but to a point. But certainly a wet product though, just always a wet grain or wet forage, it's always got a fairly limited short life because then molds try to come in there too, especially in hot weather.
Yeah, it's interesting too because we're talking about phenols, like ferulic acid is a phenolic compound, and from what I understand, the proposed compounds that are in barley straw that serve as like an algistat for ponds and everything are also phenol, some kind of phenolic compounds in the stems themselves, which is pretty cool.
Yep.
How long do you have to feed it?
That's another potential market too, is to market that straw. Straw actually, just as cattle feed right now, has high value because we feed straw to our as kind of a diet food. I liken it to people eating celery. It's mostly just fiber. Straw is very little starch, very little fat, not much protein. So it's mostly just fiber, fills them up, kind of like celery fills people up, but yet it's kind of like not contributing much to the caloric intake. So we feed that to our cows that are non-lactating. We call that a dry cow, which a cow is dry for about 2 months of her yearly cycle. Average cow milks 10 months and then is about 7 months pregnant. We are called dry her up, meaning we just quit milking her. And then she kind of has a 2-month period of non-lactation. During that period, if we keep feeding them like a milking cow, they get fat. And when cows calve, when they're fat, very bad things happen. Lots of disease processes can occur. So we have to keep them thin. So we feed them dry or a really low calorie food like straw through the dry period now. So there's massive amounts of straw fed now on dairies. So straw actually has as much value off many years as hay does. A bale of straw may cost almost as much in a lot of years as a bale of hay, which is a big change. I mean, when I was young, straw sold really cheap and hay was expensive. And now straw is about as expensive as hay and is valuable because of the feeding. Barley straw, as we get more of it, it has value. And then as Brian says, for the landscaping use too, it's desirable for that algicide.
How long do you have to feed to create the marbling? Do you have to get that better marbling? Is it like the last couple months, or do they have to be on it the whole time? They have to be.
It's normally like longer feeding period, increased marbling. So it's like, you may heard about Wagyu or Hanu, the high marbled breed. They feed up to 30 months. So they are full of marbling. So
Okay.
yeah, it's actually depending on the breed. So even if you feed Niloy or like the humpy one, both indicas, even if they feed like 5 years, they don't have any marbling. So it's highly depend on the breed.
Yeah, it takes a while for the marbling to occur. To influence the flavor of the meat, it doesn't take too long, just to get enough of the fat in there that changes the flavor. I always tell people that eat grass-fed beef, which you can buy in the store. And I always tell them, I said, well, that beef is probably fed a little bit of corn. And they're like, no, it's strictly grass-fed. And I said, well, I bet it has some corn somewhere in its diet, especially for a few weeks at the end. Because if you ate strictly grass-fed only beef, you probably would not like it, because it's going to taste grassy, kind of, or what people would describe as gamey. That's why deer that you shoot and eat down here that eat a lot of corn, are very, don't have that real gamey taste. But if you get a buck up in the UP that's only eating forage, it's going to have that gamier taste, because diet really influences the flavor of the meat.
Hey, Larry, can you hear me? I had to switch over to my phone.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you have any idea of why donkey owners really seek out barley straw to feed to their donkeys?
That's a good question. Yeah, I would not know why, because as far as feed value wise, straw is basically straw. I mean, it's very similar between all of the different grains. Wheat has, the biggest volume, I think, just by acres grown, but also just kind of yield too. You get more straw, per acre out of an acre of wheat than versus, other small grains. But as far as the nutritional quality, I think it's all very much the same. So I guess I don't know the answer to that one.
I've had several people come specifically to buy barley straw to feed to their donkeys, and I've said, okay, that's fine with me.
Interesting.
So
yeah,
something to maybe dig into a little bit more.
It probably is a softer straw than wheat straw. So in processing straw for cattle for their diets, we have the rule of thumb that we need it cut up into 2-inch, no more than 2-inch chunks, because cattle don't like to eat those long stemmy pieces. They'll kind of sort through to get to the the grain or the good stuff, and they'll sort out. But once it gets to 2 inches or less, they can't really sort that as well. So that kind of more forces them to eat their celery, so to speak. But with a donkey producer, they're not going to process that straw. Farms use wagons that have knives in them, or these other tools specifically designed to grind like a round bale of straw called a bale buster. They're going to grind that straw into 2-inch chunks. A small farm with a couple donkeys isn't going to have that. So that barley straw is probably a little more tender, not as pokey, if you will. A little better mouthfeel than the wheat straw. So it could be that. And of course, they're probably feeding it because for the same reason feed it to dry cows. They're just trying to keep those donkeys from getting too fat.
Okay. Yeah, because it's still straw. I have noticed that at times when we had straw pile next to a cattle pen, kind of a short-term cattle pen, and I did notice that they reach through the fence to choose to eat the barley straw a lot more than the wheat straw right next to it.
Yep.
And there must be something about it that makes it more palatable, like you said. That even though it's nutrition-wise, it doesn't test any different.
Yep, I think nutrition-wise the same, but it's probably a softer product, so they're gonna like to eat it or eat it better. Yeah, it's like overgrown first cut hay versus a third cut, hay.
Yeah.
So does corn produce? Corn must produce the fat, but it doesn't produce the marbling. Is that a safe thing to say? I mean, the corn is still producing fat around the edges, right?
Yeah, it's kind of one and the same, but like JK says, marbling goes a lot with diet, but it also goes with breed. Certain breeds have a lot more marbling than others. So, but diet definitely influences. You can't get the marbling unless you have the energy there, which is, more starch, more grain.
But do you get the same marbling? Okay, assuming you have a breed that marbles.
Yes.
Do you get the same marbling with corn that you get with barley, or is there a benefit in barley's?
Energy wise, barley per unit weight's got about 90% of the energy of corn, so it's slightly less. So you might get slightly less marbling with barley than corn, but it may not be that significant. I don't know what JK thinks of that.
I agree with you. It's like, yeah, that would be similar to each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's like
So-
the Japanese feeding program, like Wagyu feeding program, they use large amount of barley. So yeah, this barley also effectively increased intramuscular fat.
So what's the benefit of barley over corn?
So what I'm thinking is now is like the federal acid now. So it's the Michigan area, I think the price is more stable compared to the corn. I don't know. It's like, yeah. So that is a good thing for like selling point. Larry mentioned about that, and like people say, if you want to buy like GMO corn fed beef
Okay.
versus like the barley diet, this consumers should choose the barley fed one. So
Okay.
Yeah. People don't like GMOs, even though, as I say, they oftentimes don't even know have an understanding of GMOs, even what it means. Some years ago, a couple years ago, Jimmy Kimmel on his Late Show, when the whole GMO thing really hit, he went to a farmer's market and he just asked the question, do you look for non-GMO foods? And many of the people said, oh yes, I avoid the GMO foods. And so the next question from the interviewer was, well, what does GMO stand for? Only a couple really even knew what GMO even stood for, let alone what it meant or how it influenced anything. They didn't even know what GMO was an abbreviation for.
Yeah.
I'll tell you what, non-GMO papayas are really hard to find.
I can imagine.
So what about rumen acidification? Like barley compared to corn, is it like are they on par with each other, or is there a little bit less acidification hopefully from barley?
Yeah, well, there's two things. There's overall acid produced, but then there's rate of digestion and acid produced. So barley actually ferments really, really quickly in the rumen. So that can be a problem if fed by itself. Same as corn fed by itself can be. The drier the product, the drier the grain, though, the slower the release of acid, because kind of like steeping, it takes, in the rumen, it's basically the grain has to get steeped and wet before the enzymes start to break it down. So the drier the product, the longer that takes. So that's like with high moisture grain, high moisture barley, you have to be very careful. You can kind of over acidify the animal. The cattle have a great ability to buffer that acid, but at a certain point they can't. But if you feed some forage with it, then that really helps break that or reduce the chance of that over acidification, because forage causes the animal to release a lot of bicarb in their saliva from cud chewing, and that helps to buffer that acid. But we don't see it much anymore. I used to see cases of grain overload where people would feed too much grain to their animals, or they would get out and get into the grain bin and eat a bunch of grain, and then they would just get, like, as you say, Ryan, over acidified. They would bloat, get sick, their whole system's acidic, and a lot of times you didn't save those, they just died.
For controlling the pH, so it's like I'm thinking like feeding the limestone or ionophores, like the mentioned. We are really worried about like the barley digested too fast in the rumen, and then just rapidly drops the pH, and it causes ecstasies, and it could kill cattle. So it's just like, we need to think about that. I'm thinking like the half barley, half corn, or something like that.
Our large dairies, in their total mixed rations, they'll feed a few ounces of bicarbonate routinely to help buffer that acid. And then most farms too, beef or dairy, feed a product called that would be classified as an ionophore. And there's kind of 2 or 3 main ones that are used. And these are chemicals that they basically improve the feed efficiency. They're kind of like antibiotics, but we don't talk about it that way because we don't want to disturb the public. Because we tell the public we don't feed our animals antibiotic consistently, but we do feed these ionophores. They exert their action in kind of an antimicrobial way, but they're not antibiotics in the sense of, say, like our antibiotics we take for bacterial infections like penicillin. So, but we try to not talk about that a lot. But most cattle are, whether the beef or dairy, are fed these products now, and that also keeps those really acid-forming bacteria down. But and then that's the one good effect. And then the other effect is that it allows the growth of the bacteria that produce more of the better volatile fatty acids. So in cattle, the unique thing of cattle is they ferment fiber, the bacteria in the rumen take fiber and turn it into volatile fatty acids. Well, there's 3 main ones: acetate, butyrate, and propionate. Propionate is really the good one, because the cows or their animal's liver can produce that take that propionate and directly produce glucose. The other ones have to go through more a processing, if you will, to get to glucose and energy formed. So we like the propionate, and these ionophores shift the volatile fatty acid production in the rumen more towards the propionate side and less of the butyrate and acetate. So, and at the same time suppress the real lactic acid forming bacteria too.
Cool. Yeah.
So the main products that are used for that, you'll hear, are rumensin, which the actual drug is monensin, and then the other one is called Bovatec, which is lasallicid. There's a couple other ones too, but those are the big 2 players. But if you look at cattle feeds, whether the beef or dairy, whether they're growing animals or milking, most of the feeds, they have those in it these days.
Yeah, I mean, it seems super efficient, but yeah, I can see why you'd want to maybe like downplay that and be careful about how you communicate that to the meat buying public.
Yeah, there's really no food safety risk whatsoever. That's been established a long time ago. And then we tend to not try to couch these things as they're not antibiotics, but they do exert their positive effect to animal in a antimicrobial way of shifting microbial populations slightly from one to another in the rumen. It actually benefits the animal's health quite a bit too. Kind of helps to stabilize that whole rumen environment away from, because any change in feed will upset that rumen environment. And that's because one bacterial gets out of control and at the expense of the others. Well, this rumensin or Bovatec tend to kind of mute that effect. The populations can't switch as quick.
Yeah, maybe you could call it like a prebiotic or something. People really like that term.
Yeah, so yeah, it sort of kind of is, because these products are produced by bacterial fermentation. So like rumensin is a byproduct of Streptomyces cinnamonensis bacterial fermentation or metabolism. That's where it comes from. So it is a prebiotic in essence, that chemical is.
And it doesn't show up in the milk or the meat, right?
No. Yeah, they're fully metabolized in the animal, so there's nothing that comes through in milk or meat as parent ionophore.
I always remember I saw a presentation at KBS at one point in time about the one for milk, the growth hormone that stimulates milk production.
Oh yeah, now that's another topic.
Yeah.
You know, and it's like it's naturally occurring in every cow. It's
Yes.
just how much is there, and
Right.
we've kind of selectively bred for cows that naturally produce more of that.
So
So
that was the subject of my PhD work. So you don't want to get me talking about that because but in essence, though, just in short, consumers really rejected that product when they found out about it. And so it was used for a while because a few dairies would accept it, but none of the dairies will accept milk from treated cows anymore with growth hormone, or as it was called, BST, bovine somatotropin.
That's right.
And nobody will buy milk now. So you could use it on a farm, but the dairy's not going to buy your milk, so nobody uses it anymore. It's kind of a technology that's just sitting there on the shelf that does produce, improves milk production by about 10 to 15%, but we can't use it because consumers will not tolerate it.
Yeah, there's a taboo surrounding gibberellin or gibberellic acid in malt production too.
Yep.
Naturally,
Same kind of issue. Yeah. That because we're just adding a little extra of the acid that's already there, so it wouldn't affect food safety whatsoever. But you mentioned that this is malt that was produced with GA. Brewers go, I don't want that. That's not natural.
Yeah. And it's not in a maltster's best interest to use too much. Like when you use too much, it destroys any positive effects that you're trying to achieve. That and
Franken malt.
Yeah. The reason that was even developed as a technique was to deal with subpar barley in the UK. That and abrasion. It was to actually save barley crop that would normally be unmaltable. So, yeah, Sir Jeff Palmer kind of helped save the industry for a period of years there by using that. But it's like evil or whatever. So don't use it. All right.
Yeah, BT corns kind of falls in that same category. I mean, it just stimulates the plant to make more of something it already makes, and organic systems let you spray BT all over it, but if you make the plant make it naturally through genetics, oh my God.
Yeah, consumers are strange that way for sure. It's these technologies, even ones that are, really in their best interest, just the one that comes to mind too is the high beta carotene rice, which other countries have adopted. But here, I think if you came out with, yellow rice, people would go, I'm not eating that crap. Because it's GMO. It's just got extra, but it's going to be a healthier rice because now you're basically enhanced the vitamin A level, which a lot of people are lacking. It would, it'd be beneficial, but I'm sure if you came out with a slightly yellow rice here in the U.S., people say, I'm not eating that crap.
Yeah.
Well, so what if people in countries that are have diets deficient in vitamin A are going blind? It's worth it not to have GMOs, right?
Well, it'd be nice if people were accepting more of GMOs because that 10-year cycle we have to create new barley varieties. I mean, we could create better malting varieties within a couple of years if we could use GMO technology, but we just, as an industry said, we don't want to go there because we know the consumer backlash that would be there.
Yeah, especially techniques like CRISPR, it's more precise and efficient than ever. So we don't have to. Well, it's funny too because Golden Promise. So I was at a conference and we were talking all about Golden Promise and the mutant collection that was used to breed Golden Promise was exposed to radiation. Like they use radiation to just, distort the DNA and mutate all kinds of crazy, like just shotgun approach to we're gonna mutate this barley and then find out what happens. Like that's not scary.
Yeah. I find that incredibly scary.
Yeah. Chemical mutagens too. I mean, that's the old fashioned way of plant breeding.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But that's the more accepted than, like you say, more precise technology like CRISPR that's just going to edit just very specific genes. Whereas, of course, the other argument there always is too is if you ask people like, well, would you eat like a beef cross steer? This breed crossed with this breed. Sure. Well, that's really GMO now but not even very precise because we just assorted a whole bunch of genes. Whereas with GMO, we're just going to reassort just change just a very tiny gene sequence. When we crossbreed, we sort a lot of different genes. Well, that's natural, and that's why it's okay.
Yeah, I would have to say probably the majority of the high-producing non-GMO varieties of anything out there are basically mutant. They are the mutants.
Yep.
Oh well. I don't think we're going to solve that thing today. The whole
No.
GMO thing.
The public perceives what the public perceives,
Yeah.
and we can try to educate, but it only goes so far. I mean, that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Well, keep at it. That's what we're here for.
Right.
Well, on that note, it's just us 6, so next
Yeah, but
week.
it'll probably go viral with that last part.
Oh yeah, yeah. This will be up on
Oh.
YouTube.
all that Frankenfood talk.
Yeah. Yeah. If they make it this far, they'll get some spicy content. That's for sure. Next week we have a spotlight on the Craft Beverage Council with Dr. Dean Boz, who on my screen is right down there, and Janelle Jagman, who's the director of the Craft Beverage Council. It's housed under MDARD. I'm sure we all know this, but housed under MDARD, and they support a lot of research that we do, and they are very supportive of the ag-based value chains that support craft brewing, distilling, cider making, wine making in the state. So it'll be cool.
Mm-hmm.
Very cool.
Thanks.
So
everybody.
next week will be week 7.
Week 7. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So we have 8 happy hours in our initial run, and then we're gonna see if we want to do more after the holiday season's over. And we got fun stuff coming in January, hopefully. Election stuff again. But yeah, once the dust settles a little bit after the holidays and all that, we'll start back up again when people have more time. Cool.
Thanks, guys. That was super interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, feel free to invite some friends. I'm really happy with the way this one turned out. I've learned a lot about beef, which I didn't even know that. Yeah, I didn't even know that I didn't know that much about beef. That doesn't make any sense. Anyway.
It kind of did, but it kind of didn't.
Yeah, it's unrehearsed, obviously. So have a great weekend, everybody, and I'll see you next week.